All right. I think we can get started. It is time. So today I'm going to be talking about building beautiful Blazor websites in .NET 8. It's a bit of a tongue twister as a title, but I think it's a topic that a lot of people are interested in learning a little bit more about. All right. So I'm Shaun Walker. I'm the founder of Devessence, which is a software consulting company that specializes in Microsoft-based consulting. I'm also the creator of a few open source projects. One that I've been working on more recently is called Oqtane. I'm also the original creator of .NETNuke, which was a very popular open source project, which was created, way back in 2002. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been an MVP for 15 years. And hopefully I get renewed again. Being part of the Microsoft MVP program is a great opportunity, but it's also based on a lot of hard work in terms of engaging with the Microsoft community. I'm also chair of the .NET Foundation Project Committee. I've been a volunteer as part of the .NET Foundation since 2014, when it was originally founded, and I've volunteered in various capacities as part of the foundation ever since. The project committee is responsible for reviewing .NET-based open source projects that apply to become members of the .NET Foundation. I've participated in a lot of different books over the years, and yeah, that's about that. So let's talk a little bit about Blazor, because that's what we're here to talk about today. And Blazor is a very sort of interesting technology in that it's very versatile and can be used for a lot of different purposes. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Blazor. We're not going to spend too much time on that because I'm assuming that most people who are coming to this talk have heard of Blazor and know something about it. We're going to focus a bit more on .NET 8 and some of the new capabilities that were introduced for Blazor in .NET 8. And then I'm going to, of course, focus in on the topic of this presentation, which is, how to build really nice looking websites using Blazor. I wanted to start off because point out a little bit about the .NET Web UI history of the different capabilities that have been part of the .NET framework and .NET Core over time. And this timeline, I think, really emphasizes how long some of these technologies have been around. So obviously .NET was originally introduced in 2000. So, I mean, it's almost coming on 25 years old. .NET Core was introduced in 2014. So it's a decade old at this point. Obviously, you have UI technologies like ASP.NET Web Forms, which were introduced at the very beginning and are still being widely used and are still supported by Microsoft. However, there's really not much development or maintenance going on around those or that framework any longer. MVC was introduced in 2009 to solve a number of the different sort of limitations that were part of web forms. And so it's been a very popular choice for developers ever since. It made the transition from .NET Framework to .NET Core and is still widely used today to build web UI. Razor Pages was introduced in 2017 as basically a more simplistic way of developing web applications. So it didn't have as much of the complications of building MVC applications. So it was a more simplistic approach. A lot of people really liked Razor Pages, and of course it's still supported and widely used today. And then Blazor was introduced in 2018. And so the interesting thing I find when I talk to people is a lot of folks believe that Blazor is very new and doesn't have a whole lot of adoption and is sort of an experiment by Microsoft. But of course, if you look at this timeline, I mean, it's been around for 6 years already. So it is already a very mature technology and has a lot of capabilities and seems to be the area where the Microsoft team is pouring a lot of investment in terms of creating a lot of innovation. And it seems to be the path going forward to the future where Microsoft is making the most investments. So if we talk a little bit about Blazor from the very earliest stages, we're talking about interactive Blazor. And I say interactive because, of course, in the more recent version in .NET 8, Blazor also has another render mode that's called static. But from the beginning, Blazor was interactive, and really it was targeted at providing a capability for developers to build single-page applications. And it was an alternative to building single-page applications using C# as opposed to JavaScript, because obviously there's a lot of JavaScript frameworks that have been around for quite some time that are really powerful and really good for building single-page applications, but of course they rely on JavaScript on the front end. And so if you're a more of a traditional back-end developer, very comfortable with C#, then you also perhaps wanted a tool set that you could use on the front end that used C#. And so that's what interactive Blazor initially provided. The first version of interactive Blazor was, of course, Blazor Server. And basically, Blazor Server relied on a socket connection between the browser and the server using SignalR. And that was how the user interface was refreshed or rendered. So any content changes that were made, they were actually figured out on the server, and then they were pushed to the client where they were rendered. And that was all done over a persistent SignalR connection. The next hosting model that arrived was Blazor WebAssembly, and Blazor WebAssembly had been part of Blazor since the very beginning, but it took a little while before Microsoft basically deemed it to be production ready. And so it was released after Blazor Server. And Blazor WebAssembly obviously relies on WebAssembly, which is an industry standard for running applications natively in the browser without plugins. And so with Blazor WebAssembly, you're able to run .NET-based assemblies directly natively in the browser. And so that was a new capability that was added. So now you had these sort of two options for building web applications. You could choose to host them on the server, or you could choose to run them directly in the browser. Later, when Microsoft shipped .NET MAUI, they added support for an additional sort of hosting model, and this was Blazor Hybrid. Blazor Hybrid essentially uses a web view component that runs on a device that can render Razor components to produce UI output. And so in this model, of course, Blazor Hybrid, you're not using Blazor Server and you're not using Blazor WebAssembly, so you're not using SignalR or WebAssembly. These are C# code that's actually executed natively on the device itself. So whether this was a mobile device or a desktop device, basically your Razor components could be rendered directly into a web view component. And so with that, you could sort of extend Blazor to other devices beyond a web browser. And so with interactive Blazor and with those sort of three capabilities, you were able to target, all the different types of devices that are available today. So you have the ability to target mobile devices using Blazor Hybrid. You have the ability to target web through a web browser using Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly. And you can build desktop applications as well, again, using the Blazor Hybrid model. So a lot of versatility with this technology. And I think the cool thing is you could build Razor components that actually could run in any of these devices without any code changes at all. So that was also a very powerful capability. This sort of write once, run anywhere capability was something that developers had been hoping for a long time. And so Blazor has been able to deliver that. And if we focus a little bit on interactive Blazor, of course, it's had its own roadmap that is followed. And I think the interesting thing here is that there's been very rapid innovation when it comes to interactive Blazor. So Microsoft has sort of had this initial vision way back in sort of 2017 when Blazor first arrived on the scene. And they imagined it catering to a lot of different use cases to satisfy the needs of .NET developers. So initially, between 2018 and 2019, Blazor was an experimental project, meaning the team was working on it internally, and it had not yet been approved as an official sort of user interface-based technology by Microsoft. In 2019, it was approved and it was moved into .NET Core at that point as part of .NET Core 3.0. And the initial release of Blazor was, of course, Blazor Server, followed by Blazor WebAssembly a year later. and then followed by Blazor Hybrid just maybe 18 months later. So you can see that the team has made very significant investments in Blazor to increase its capabilities over that time. And sort of these investments are really sort of pushing the needle and really developing sort of new opportunities to developers to use the technology. All that being said, there of course are some challenges when it came to interactive Blazor, because of course no technology is perfect. The first one that people would often run into when it came to interactive Blazor is there was sort of a, when you wanted to get started with it, there was an initial fork in the road, right? And because there were two models for developing web applications, and that was, of course, Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly. And you had to make a decision fairly early on in terms of which path you were going to take, because there were some subtle differences in the way that you would have to develop your components. Oftentimes, the sort of requirements or the rationale for choosing a particular path wasn't exactly obvious. And so this created, some challenges for people to even get started with Blazor. So that was one of the main challenges, I guess, with interactive Blazor is sort of, which approach do I take with it? And then once you'd actually, made your decision, there were also some other limitations around interactive Blazor. And these would, manifest themselves depending on, I guess, what your use case was. But if you chose Blazor WebAssembly, by its very nature, Blazor WebAssembly has to download assemblies to the browser so that they can run natively in the browser. Of course, downloading assemblies has some latency depending on the internet connection that you're using. And so it takes some time for the browser to be able to download those assemblies, load them, and then execute them. And so because of that, for a new user who had never, downloaded the WebAssembly bits for an application to their browser, the startup time would be slower than what they would expect with, other types of technologies that were running in the browser. Of course, once the WebAssembly bits were loaded into the browser, then your application could run at near native speeds. So you'd have great performance, but it was just that initial impression, which was sometimes a problem when you were using Blazor WebAssembly. Blazor Server, on the other hand, of course, was running on the server using a SignalR connection, a WebSocket connection, which was very fast. So the initial content that was rendered to the browser was very fast. So it didn't suffer from the same problems as WebAssembly. However, Blazor Server, because of its interactive nature, would actually maintain state on the server for every user connection. So, and we're talking about, let's say you're building a public-facing website, and you have a lot of anonymous users that are coming to your website. Every single one of those anonymous users would actually take up some space on your server in terms of, or consume some resources in terms of memory. And so memory was a bit of a gating factor when it came to Blazor Server. And so because of that, it had some scalability limitations around this technology. And so really, like, regardless, I guess, of which path you chose, whether it was Blazor WebAssembly or Blazor Server, you would either run into maybe some performance issues or some scalability issues, depending on your application. And I'll say this, this was not always the case. There was a lot of folks who built internal-facing Blazor applications using Blazor Server, which have like a finite number of users that are using the application. And in that particular case, Blazor Server was a very great choice, right? It was very fast. And you didn't really run into very many scalability issues at all because you had a smaller audience that you were catering to. And so, depending on how you chose to use these technologies, you may not have even run into some of these limitations. One of the other limitations of Blazor, in terms of interactive Blazor, was the fact it was sort of based on this premise that you could do everything that you needed in C#, right? All of your front-end user interface needs could be satisfied by C#. And so, in essence, you were encouraged not to use JavaScript. However, there was a way that you could use JavaScript, and that was through something called JS Interop. The problem with JS interop is although it worked, it would sometimes have some performance issues, and it was not sort of a intuitive model for developers who had, traditionally been using the standard way of developing web applications where you could like sprinkle JavaScript into your output and it would work sort of in the standard way that a browser would interpret JavaScript. Blazor, interactive Blazor didn't really support JavaScript in that way, so you'd have to sort of abstract it, create JS interop classes, and call the JavaScript through those classes. So it just created a lot of extra work on the part of developers in order to use JavaScript. So it wasn't convenient. And I guess the last thing I would say is, so over time, of course, interactive Blazor, it had multiple hosting models. Depending on which hosting model you chose, there would be probably different techniques that you would need to use for things like data access and things. And so you'd have like this great tool belt of tools, but sometimes it wasn't easy to figure out which tool in that tool belt was the appropriate one to use in each case. And so it was complicated. And so those were some of the initial sort of challenges or limitations around interactive Blazor. Moving forward to .NET 8, Microsoft was very ambitious, and they wanted to address a lot of those pain points that I've just talked about that were part of the earlier versions of interactive Blazor. They were also paying attention to the industry, and they had noticed that a lot of the JavaScript frameworks, JavaScript single-page application frameworks, were actually migrating towards the server, like where they had always been client-side technologies. They were now migrating towards the server to be able to enhance their capabilities by using some server-side capabilities as well. And so sort of all of these different factors were considered, and a whole lot of new capabilities were added to Blazor in .NET 8. So it was sort of rebranded as full stack web UI, because basically with Blazor in .NET 8, you could now focus on running it not just sort of client side or using it as a client side technology, but you could also really embrace server side techniques as well. So as part of .NET 8 with Blazor, there was a new Blazor web template, which changed a lot of the sort of fundamentals of how Blazor actually operates. And so if you were familiar with building Blazor applications in the past using the default template that was provided, you would have to come up to speed on the sort of new approach for building Blazor applications using this new Blazor web template. Static server-side rendering was introduced, which essentially means that the content is being rendered on the server and then being sent to the browser. So more of a traditional request response model, but allowing the server to do more of the work. Enhanced navigation was introduced as well. This was inspired by some other technologies such as Turbo, which is of course from the Ruby on Rails community, which simulates sort of a single page application experience, but runs more of the logic on the server side. Enhanced forms also follows kind of this enhanced paradigm. Stream rendering would be for scenarios where maybe you had server side logic that might take a little bit longer to load or to execute, and you wanted to provide an initial rendering to the user so that they knew that something was going on. So stream rendering allowed sort of multiple renderings of content to occur within the same request to provide a better user experience. An interactive auto render mode was introduced, which sort of attempts to provide the best of both worlds in terms of in terms of interactive Blazor. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. There was also, of course, with a static server-side rendering, there were cases where you may want to have components that were interactive that would work along with your server-side rendered components. And so you could have some components that are on a page that are interactive and some components that are static, so that you have the maximum flexibility to do what you would need to do with your application. Obviously, all of this was originally released as part of .NET 8 in November of 2023, which is, like five months ago now. And with the changes that came in Blazor in .NET 8, Microsoft is really positioning Blazor as the future of web UI on .NET. And this isn't just something that I'm saying. You can go and look for yourself, and you'll find plenty of messaging from Microsoft, which is basically saying that the future of web UI is Blazor. It's sort of like the tool that is intended to, bring all of these different web UI technologies together. Because now it is capable of doing both server-side and client-side UI. So talking a little bit about static server-side rendering for a moment, which is often abbreviated as SSR. So basically, in this render mode, your application is actually rendered statically on the server by default. And so your components are executed on the server, they render content, and that content is sent to the browser. And so if you think about most applications, you'll recognize that there sort of is a mixture of both static content and interactive content that are part of your application. In fact, probably the majority of most applications are static, right? They're like the Chrome, the navigation, the footer, right? There's lots of different aspects of an application which don't change at all and are just static content. And in those cases, it doesn't make sense to render that content as interactive components, because every interactive component has some overhead that's associated to it, right? It maintains state. It has events that it has to pay attention to in terms of its life cycle. And none of that is really necessary if you're just rendering some static content. And so by treating static content as static, as it's intended to be, you basically get a lot better performance and scalability out of a system. And then, as I mentioned, there are, of course, some aspects of your application which are more interactive in nature, which, probably have buttons or things that users are intended to click and need to change dynamically at runtime. And so those are your interactive content regions, and those can be rendered as interactive components. And so you kind of have this model where you can mix and match the different types of components to achieve the optimal sort of rendering effect. I think that the one thing that was confusing when .NET 8 was introduced with Blazor, with static server-side rendering, is people sort of thought, oh, well, they basically just introduced an equivalent to MVC or Razor Pages that works with Blazor. And of course, those technologies are very sort of low level, based on request and response. And in fact, if you take a closer look at what Blazor is doing, at least in its default configuration, it is using static server-side rendering, that is true, but it is also using something called enhanced navigation. And in enhanced navigation, what happens is every sort of navigation. So if you're clicking like a hyperlink in your application, Blazor actually intercepts that navigation. And that's what the blazor.web.js, which is part of the Blazor web sort of approach, uses, and it performs a fetch request. And of course, the fetch API is supported by all browsers now. So it performs a fetch request. It receives some HTML back from the server, and then it actually does a differencing algorithm and it's able to patch the DOM based on the differences in the HTML it receives. So this isn't like a full page refresh model, which is what, of course, Razor Pages or MVC uses. This is still using a DOM differencing type of approach for updating only those portions of the user interface which have changed, which is a lot more efficient and produces a much better user experience. And so when people talk about enhanced navigation, this is what it means, and it's enabled by default as part of the static rendering approach when you use Blazor in .NET 8. Stream rendering, another new capability that was, of course, included, usually is more applicable to longer running server-side processes. So maybe if you have like a database or some data access, which is going to take longer, is more intensive, or you have to make a remote API call, things that have some latency to them. You might want the user to get some initial HTML sent back to them in their browser so that they get at least some rendering to begin with. And then while the server continues to work, and then when it finishes its work, it can send the rest of the HTML to the browser, and the DOM can be patched with that final content. And so, again, this is all about improving the user experience, providing more responsive feedback to users. And again, this is more intended to be used in those scenarios where you have longer running processes. Interactive auto mode was the new interactive render mode that was introduced as part of .NET 8. And in this mode, of course, a browser sends a request to the server. The server will initially respond by using a SignalR or WebSocket connection. So the traditional Blazor server model, which responds very quickly, renders content very fast. At the same time, it will make a request to download the WebAssembly bits in the background. So the benefit here is the user gets, an immediate feedback to their request. So they get a UI rendered, and in the background, WebAssembly is being downloaded. And then on a subsequent navigation from the browser, so if a user clicks on a link, then the subsequent rendering that occurs, it'll notice that WebAssembly has already been downloaded to the browser, and it'll then use WebAssembly to render the output, as opposed to using SignalR. So it sort of does this transition from SignalR to WebAssembly, and it happens for the most part in the background, so the user's not aware of it. The user gets the benefit of a quick, immediate response of content being rendered, and then also the benefit of subsequent navigations rendering very quickly because they're being rendered natively in the browser using WebAssembly. So essentially, this auto render mode was intended to provide sort of the best of both worlds, right? Where I explained before, there was limitations about the interactive render modes for Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. This kind of leverages the best aspects of both to provide a render mode that works, well in all scenarios. I think the one thing that people don't always understand, though, when it comes to interactive auto render mode, is this all doesn't happen within the same request, right? You make the initial request. That initial request is rendered using Blazor Server, and then you have to actually make a subsequent navigation for the WebAssembly aspect to kick in. And so this is sometimes confusing if you're maybe looking at your browser dev tools to see what's actually happening, and it's, you'll think that it's not working as is intended, but you actually have to make a subsequent navigation to actually see the effect of this. And then again, let's talk a little bit about like the fundamentals of the web, right? We've always had HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I mentioned earlier that JavaScript had some challenges in interactive Blazor. And so JavaScript support in .NET 8, when you're using the static rendering techniques, behaves a little bit differently. So you can't use some of the techniques that interactive Blazor uses. For example, in interactive Blazor, if you're going to render a button, you would use an @onClick event, which allows sort of interactive Blazor to wire up the click handler and take care of a lot of sort of aspects of the form submission and things like that for you. That is not supported in static Blazor when you're using static server-side rendering. However, it is possible to use more traditional approaches, approaches like you've always been used to using with MVC or Razor Pages or more traditional web technologies. So you can use a standard on-click handler, right? This would be the standard like JavaScript-based on-click handler to call some kind of a method. And so with this, you can use traditional JavaScript, right? You can have a JavaScript library that's loaded with your methods declared, and then from your HTML code that's rendered, you can call onClick and it'll trigger that method. So the techniques that you've been used to using with more traditional web technology are possible on static Blazor. The one caveat which I have to mention is that the one thing that doesn't work consistently with sort of traditional JavaScript is the onload event. And this is because, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, when you're using static server-side rendering, you're also using enhanced navigation by default. And enhanced navigation is sort of, is doing that sort of workflow that I described where, it's doing a fetch API request and it's patching the DOM. And so because of that, you can't hook it into the traditional onload event, which is something that is often used in JavaScript, right, to execute logic when the page loads. However, and the enhanced navigation capability that's part of Blazor does have an API and does have events that you can hook so that you know when the UI is being rendered, right? So you can't use onload, the traditional JavaScript method, but there are other approaches you can use. And if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend you look at this open source project, which is by McKinnon Buck, who's a member of the Blazor product team at Microsoft. So he created an open source little project, which is quite handy if you want to execute logic using JavaScript on page transitions. And I'm going to demonstrate that as part of my demo, but this is a very useful open source project to check out, because this isn't a capability that's natively part of the Blazor library as part of the static server-side rendering, right? So this is a separate open source project that adds some additional capability. And so with all that, what are some of the challenges of Blazor that Blazor still has in .NET 8? Well, I guess, where I mentioned previously that, Blazor had a lot of different capabilities that were part of it, and it was sometimes difficult to figure out, which technique to use to solve a particular problem. Well, I'll have to say that like Blazor in .NET 8 just compounded that even further because it added even more capabilities. And so as a software developer, when you're using Blazor, there are so many different techniques that you can use to write applications that, again, it's sometimes very challenging to figure out, right, what the right approach is to solve your specific problem. And I've had the quote here, with great power comes great responsibility. I certainly wouldn't want the Blazor team to remove any of the functionality that they've added, because I think it's, all of those technologies have a place, right? They all have a specific use case that they're intended to solve. But as a software developer, you really have to sort of come up to speed on all of the different capabilities so that you can understand how to apply each technique to solve the right problem. And the other thing, I guess, with Blazor and the addition of these, new render modes, right, where you have static render mode and interactive render mode, you really have to take a closer look at your application architecture and figure out, how to use these different techniques to achieve your goals. And what I've personally found is that the render modes are best aligned with the user experience that you're trying to create. So, for example, if you're building a website and the majority of the users that are coming to your website are anonymous users, right? They are not intended to log in or authenticate. Then you're going to want, those user interfaces that those types of users are consuming to be statically rendered for the most part, right? That'll produce the highest performance and the most scalability for your application. Of course, you're still going to have some users that need to authenticate. And for those users, perhaps there's like some back-end functionality that they need to access. It's perfectly fine if that functionality is using interactive Blazor, because creating components that use interactive Blazor is still a much productive experience for developers than building static components. Or at least, again, this is my opinion based on building a bunch of different components using both techniques. But whereas in the past, if you were building a Blazor application and you only had access to the interactive render modes, the entire application was just assumed to be interactive. You didn't have any choices to make, so you didn't have anything to evaluate. But now with the new capabilities with static Blazor, you can actually break down the different use cases, and you can say, okay, this use case would benefit from being statically rendered, and then this other use case would benefit from being interactive. And so you, as an application architect, you need to take that into consideration. Some of the other Blazor challenges in .NET 8, and these are well documented. If you look in the the .NET ASP.NET Core repo, you'll see lots of issues being logged around these particular items, or at least somehow related to these items. These are like sort of 3 themes that seem to be recurring in regards to Blazor and .NET 8. One is passing application state between static and interactive components. Because they sort of operate in a different sort of process model, the application state doesn't just pass magically, automatically in between them. As a software developer, you need to actually manually develop techniques to pass the state yourself between different components. And there's not a lot of great examples of how to do this, unfortunately. I've had to tackle it as part of a larger application that I've been developing. And there are ways to solve this, and there's other developers who have created alternative techniques as well. Microsoft has basically said that this is not a problem that they're going to solve in the short term. I don't even believe it's on the roadmap for .NET 9, but I would expect that over time there will be more knowledge that's shared about the different techniques that you can use for doing this. But this is something to be aware of, though. So as soon as you want to build a Blazor application that has aspects of it that are being rendered statically and being rendered interactively, then you're going to run into this problem where you probably have some sort of state that you want to pass around, and you need to be able to pass that state between the various components. Another challenge that a lot of people have identified is related to the behavior of the enhanced navigation. Because of the way it sort of intercepts requests and does the DOM patching, your scroll position that you're used to in your browser doesn't always work consistently. So for example, if you're navigating to a new page in your application, you would typically expect that the browser scroll position would be reset to the top of the page. That doesn't always seem to happen because of the enhanced navigation. And there's a lot of other little quirky behaviors around scroll position, which can cause your users some confusion at times because they don't end up in the position that they're used to based on the traditional way that browsers work. Microsoft is working on solutions for this problem that probably will be solved in .NET 9. And I'm sure there'll be third-party custom solutions that emerge as well to solve this problem. And then the last thing I'm going to mention is .NET 8 was very ambitious, so it had a whole lot of functionality that was part of it as far as Blazor is concerned. .NET 8, of course, was scheduled to ship in November of 2023. And so basically everything had to be done by then in order for it to ship. And because of that, I think not all of the use cases were, thoroughly tested prior to the release. And so, in fact, a lot of the SDK releases that have come since, the patch releases of .NET 8, contain very critical bug fixes that you are going to want to make sure you have installed in your environment. Otherwise, you might run into some very strange behaviors. I ran into this, and I probably wasted a couple weeks of time just, hitting my head against something which, in fact, was, a problem in the earlier versions of Blazor as part of .NET 8, and not something that I could fix myself. So make sure you're running the latest service packs for .NET 8. So that you have all of the latest fixes, because at this point, it's up to 8.04 now. That was released last week. And most of the initial challenges around Blazor and .NET 8 seem to be resolved now. But again, it took like 5 months. So now is a great time to jump in. All right, so moving on to like the actual topic. The title was Building Beautiful Websites with Blazor and .NET 8. So we're going to talk a little bit about, how you can build a web application or a website that exemplifies some of the modern sort of user interface styles and usability of modern websites. And of course, I have to show a picture of the default Blazor template, because this is what most people envision when they think of a Blazor application. Unfortunately, this template has been used for probably far too many applications at this point, because developers are more interested in building out the functionality that they need, as opposed to, making their application sort of cosmetically beautiful. This template is very simple in its approach, and of course it needs to be, because it's not intended to be something that you would deploy into production. However, you've seen a lot of this template actually show up in production scenarios. I'm going to mention this site built on Blazor.net. It was actually a site that I created a couple of years ago. And I created it because there wasn't the common question that would come up in the early stages of Blazor was, is anybody using this technology? Give me some examples of some websites that are actually using it. And so I created this built on Blazor site as a gallery so that people could submit their URLs of Blazor sites that they had created. And then the community could see some of the, various examples of sites that had been created with the technology. It identifies whether a site is running Blazor WebAssembly, Blazor Server, or even Blazor Web in .NET 8. And so you can see how, how various sites have been implemented and which technology choices they've made. But one thing that you'll see, because there's, probably 150 sites that are represented in this gallery now. Unfortunately, not a lot of them exemplify great sort of UI techniques, right? They're not typically examples of what you would consider to be great modern websites. There are, of course, some exceptions. There are some good ones, but I would say the vast majority of them are probably created by developers, and not a lot of thought or effort was put into the UI. Hopefully that will change as we go forward, especially with the capabilities that were offered as part of .NET 8 with static server-side rendering. And so, if you wanted to build a website that, exemplifies sort of, the modern approach for doing that, I thought it would be good to create an example of how to do this. So I actually created an open source theme. And so the URL at the bottom here it's an open source project, so you can see all the code for it. I personally am not a very skilled web designer. I'm more of a back-end developer. And so my approach to creating web design is to go out to the web and find a good web design. And so, for example, if you focus in on some of the most popular CSS frameworks, like for example, Bootstrap or others, you can find amazing web templates that have been created by professional designers that you can use. Some are free and open source, some are available at a nominal charge. A lot of them have been developed over time with a lot of care put into them, where they have a lot of really modern techniques that are used as part of them. They're responsive, so they operate well in all different device sizes. These are all things that I don't want to waste my time with because I'm not good at that stuff. So that's my preferred approach for doing web design. And what I found was it was sometimes difficult to take a design that had been created by somebody else and retrofit it into interactive Blazor. I tried that a number of times, and I still ended up consuming far too much time trying to get that to work. So I'm happy to say that with Blazor in .NET 8, it's become much better. I'm going to base my demo today on Oqtane, which is an open source project that I actually created. I'm going to use it as for my demo because, quite frankly, I would never build an application using the Blazor default template. It is basically like a hello world template that provides no functionality to it at all. And if I can use something that provides far advanced functionality, of course I'm going to do that, because why would I, reinvent the wheel over and over again? I want to build an application. I don't want to build a whole bunch of infrastructure. So that's why I'm going to use Oqtane for my demo. So, all right. So I'm going to head over to Visual Studio. And first of all, I'm going to show you in my browser. So if we take a look at this Arsha template, is actually a template that's available on the Bootstrap Made site. It's a licensed template, web template, meaning I think I had to spend $30 to get the license to it. And it has a lot of capabilities as part of it. So this is just the HTML file that is part of it. Of course, if you get a web template online, you get CSS, HTML, and JavaScript that provide all the functionality for it. And as I scroll down, we can see it has, nice animate on scroll kind of effects. It's got some nice sort of CSS rendering as part of it. I can even click on to watch a video, so it'll display a video to me. Obviously, that URL is not available, but yeah, so it's got a lot of nice techniques. It's got some JavaScript where I have a portfolio of images and I can click on it and it resorts them dynamically on the client side. It's got all these, great lines. It's got a pricing page. So it's got all kinds of stuff. And it's like, okay, well, I would like a website that has all of this capability as well. But I would like it in Blazor. So how can I do that? And so with Oqtane, so Oqtane is a application framework, which is designed in such a way so that it's modular. And so I don't write my code directly in the Oqtane framework. I use it like I would use Blazor as a framework. And so I have the Oqtane framework installed, and now I created a theme. And so I have an Oqtane theme here that's for this Arsha Bootstrap Made template. And this theme has some components that are part of it, and it has some static assets that are part of it. So first of all, if we look at something called a theme info. So these are basically classes that are defined as part of the Oqtane framework. And so in my theme info, I provide a little bit of metadata about this theme that I'm creating. And then I also outline all of the different static assets that are going to be used as part of this theme. I took these static asset references directly from that HTML file, which was part of the Bootstrap Made theme. And so we'll see here we've got fonts, we've got CSS files, we've got JavaScript files. And that's basically the extent of all of the static assets that I need to be able to pull in order to use this template. I also created a component. So this Razor component is going to be my theme, and it's going to be rendered using static server-side Blazor. So this theme has a header section to it where it shows a logo and it shows a navigation menu. And it's also going to show things like a user profile and a login button so that I can log in and give me access to a control panel. It's also got a hero section. The hero section would be, this top section here, which is rendered on this page, which might not be something that I need on every page. It's got a main section as well, where I'm going to be able to put content. And then it's got a footer section as well. And so in Oqtane, I can also have a settings component. So I have a settings component, which allows me through the user interface to define some parameters. And those parameters are going to be used at runtime in the theme that I've created. And so that's what it's loading my themes. And it's dynamically setting some different content, like for my footer and my hero area based on the settings I'm going to provide at runtime. And basically, that's all there is to it. So not very complicated. There's not that many components that are part of this. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run this application right now. All right, and we're going to do this from scratch. So meaning the first thing that's going to come up is Oqtane. And it's going to show me the install wizard because I have not configured a connection string for a database yet. So this is a brand new installation. I have to create an actual account so that I can log into the application so I can administrate it. So I'll create the account with the default site template and go ahead and install it. And initially what it's going to do is it's just going to, create an initial site with some initial content in it and the default theme, which is part of Oqtane. So the default theme is this black and blue theme, and there's very, few sort of pages that are part of it. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to log in to the application using the account that I had specified. And if we go into the admin dashboard, and this is what I'm talking about, like if I use the Blazor default application template to build an app, I don't get any of this functionality which is available. So of course I'm going to use Oqtane. So if I go into the site settings and I go into the UI component area, I can see that I'm using a static render mode and I'm using server or SignalR, a Blazor server for interactivity. Because my site has both static components in it and interactive components, so I have to specify my choices for that. And these are the default choices that are part of the application. By default, it's going to use pre-rendering as well. And then I have a hybrid option here if I want to enable this site so that it works in a .NET MAUI Blazor hybrid scenario. All right, so I'm going to, because I've already compiled this theme, I'm going to go into my application and I'm going to change the appearance of it. So I can go in there and I can change my theme, and I'm going to change it to the Arsha theme, which is the theme I was just showing you that I developed. So I have a default theme and a default container. And by making this change, my whole application changes. So the look and feel of the application changed to use the look and feel of that Arsha template. And if I go to my home page, I can see that, again, it's used that content. But it doesn't really look like the Arsha theme yet. And that's because sort of this default theme doesn't have a hero section. It doesn't have the content, right? It's just providing a navigation menu and a footer by default. Okay, so how do I make my home page actually look like the Arsha theme? Well, to do that, I can go into edit mode, and I'm going to actually get rid of some of these different modules that are part of this page, because there's again multiple components that are rendered here, which I can control at runtime and get rid of things. All right, so I'm going to have a single component here that I can use. Now I'm going to go into my control panel, and I get to go into my edit area, and I can go into the theme settings. The theme settings is that component that I showed you earlier that was developed as part of my theme. And I'm going to load some default hero HTML text in it. And I'm going to save it, which is now going to dynamically inject this hero section at the top of my page. So now it's starting to look a lot closer to what the actual Arsha theme looks like. But what about the rest of the content? For that, I can go back into edit mode again. And I'm going to go into my manage settings first. And I have some container settings. I'm going to say, yeah, I don't want to display the title that's displayed at the top of that module. Get rid of that. All right, it's gone now. So that title that was here is now gone. And I can go in and I can edit content. And I'm going to go into a raw HTML editor, get rid of all of this content that was initially included. And I have a whole section of content which I've taken from that Arsha template from the HTML file. And I'm just going to plug it in here and save it. And boom. I now have a site that looks just like the Arsha theme and has all of the nice fly, like animate on scroll effects. It's got like the JavaScript all working properly. And so that's pretty cool. So using Blazor and using static server-side rendering, I was able to render, a site that looks exactly like the original Arsha template. So now I can show you a few other things here. So one of the things that is a little bit more difficult to achieve with interactive Blazor, and I'm going to go back to Visual Studio for a moment. And so for JavaScript, I basically took the JavaScript file that was part of the Arsha template that was provided from Bootstrap Made. And all I had to do to it was I had to include this sort of export function for onUpdate. This is actually using that open source project from McKinnon Buck so that I'm able to hook a JavaScript event and call a JavaScript method every time the page needs to be re-rendered. And by doing that, that's how I am able to call JavaScript to do things like the animate on scroll and all of the things that were part of the default Bootstrap Made template that I used. So that works well for static Blazor, but for interactive Blazor, you have to do things a slightly different way. So again, I was able to use the JavaScript, but I had to declare my JavaScript in a slightly different way as an asynchronous function. And then if I go back and take a look at my component, I can also see that I had to hook the on-after render async. So for those of you who are familiar with interactive Blazor, this is a lifecycle event that's part of interactive Blazor that you can hook. And I'm going to call a JavaScript interop method, and it's going to call the load event that I just showed you that is part of that interop JS file. And so if we go back to my running application and I go into the control panel and go into my site settings, I can go down to the UI components area and I can say, I don't want to run this site statically, right? I would rather run this site interactively, meaning the entire site is going to be globally interactive. So by making this one change and saving it, my page refreshes and I'm now running SignalR with the full application interactive. And if I go to the home page, hey, everything still works because of that JavaScript interop calling the JavaScript. So everything is still working as expected. So again, I was able to create a theme that actually works both on static rendering and interactive rendering. And I'm going to show you one more thing as well. So now that I have this running in Oqtane, it provides you with also a MAUI project as well. And so, of course, as I described earlier, MAUI can use Blazor Hybrid. Blazor Hybrid can use the same exact components to render in a web view as they use to run or render in a web browser. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run this. and it's going to fire up, my Windows sort of machine emulator. And it's already pointing at my Oqtane application, same exact application. And so when it comes up, you're going to see, oh, hybrid integration is not enabled for this site. Okay, I forgot to actually enable that. So let me go back to my browser again, because it's not enabled by default. If I go into my site settings, go down to my UI component, I'm going to say, yes, I allow .NET MAUI clients to connect to this backend web server. All right, so that setting is now set. I can go back into MAUI and rerun it. And this time, there we go. We've got like the same exact site with the same exact look and feel, and even the same JavaScript like events and animate on scroll, all working within a Windows desktop rendering now. So, and I have the ability to log into this desktop application the same way I do the web. And so, yeah, so this was sort of the scope of the demonstration that I wanted to do in terms of how you can build really amazing, beautiful websites using the Blazor technology. And you can do that using either static server-side Blazor, interactive Blazor, or even Blazor hybrid. So I go back to my slides now. I think we're at time, and so I want to thank everyone for joining this presentation. I hope it was informative. Obviously, as I mentioned off the beginning, Devessence is a consulting company that I founded. We are experts with Blazor, and so if you're looking for assistance for sort of navigating either maybe a transition from interactive Blazor to static Blazor, or you're even building an application from scratch and you want to try out Blazor as a technology, definitely reach out to us. I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great remainder of your day.